cannabis science is a huge field, and I think while we've had somewhat of a moratorium on doing research with smoked marijuana as a medicine, there's this explosion in cannabinoid receptor agonists, antagonists, endocannabinoids, manipulating the endocannabinoid system. So in the late 80s or in the early 90s, before we had effective antiretroviral drugs, many AIDS patients were dying with what we call the wasting syndrome, where they really lost weight, they had fever and diarrhea, and it was about this time that the drug dronabinol or Marinol was approved for treatment of the so-called AIDS wasting syndrome. And we started to prescribe that drug to our AIDS patients who told us that it was okay, but they actually preferred smoking marijuana to taking the Marinol because they could titrate the effect much better. The kinetics of taking the drug by mouth are quite different from smoking it, so that the effect takes a longer time, and it's actually more psychoactive when taken by mouth than when smoked, and for some patients that's uncomfortable. So when antiretroviral drugs became more effective, they had a potential to interact with other substances. And we heard of a case of somebody dying of an overdose of ecstasy or MDMA when taken in conjunction with the HIV protease inhibitor drugs. So in 1996, we submitted a new proposal to the federal government asking if we could study the interaction between cannabis, either taken by mouth or smoked, and the AIDS protease inhibitor drugs to see if they were safe. NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has a congressional mandate that they can only supply research-grade substances for studies if they're being studied as substances of abuse and not as therapeutic agents. So my prior request for marijuana to see if I could reverse the AIDS wasting syndromes was not approved for that reason. But when we asked if we could study cannabis to see if it was safe in patients taking protease inhibitors, that was approved. And so we did that study, and we showed there was no damage to the level of the AIDS drug in the bloodstream, to the patient's immune system, or to the level of the virus in their bloodstream over 21 days of smoking a government cigarette 3 times a day. And that led us then to move on and do other research looking to see whether or not cannabis had any medicinal benefit in patients with HIV. Particularly, we were fortunate in California when we had a budget surplus that one of our state senators established a Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at the University of California. And that center worked out a deal with NIDA so that NIDA, the only legal source of marijuana for research in the country, would supply investigators who had been favorably peer-reviewed by the University of California Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research to do clinical trials looking at the effectiveness of smoked marijuana. So I submitted a study to look at marijuana in patients with the painful HIV-related peripheral neuropathy, which is damage to nerves in the hands and feet, for which we really didn't have any treatment. Opioid analgesics don't work well. We tried acupuncture. Most people use anti-seizure medications, and these also could interact with levels of AIDS, with the AIDS drugs. So we proposed a study to see if smoked cannabis could alleviate the pain of this peripheral neuropathy. And ultimately, we wound up doing a placebo-controlled trial where 25 patients smoked real cannabis from the government and 25 smoked cannabis from which the active ingredient had been extracted. And we showed that the group smoking the real cannabis had a decrease not only in their peripheral neuropathy pain, but in an experimental pain that we created in the patients by heating their skin to 104 degrees and then applying capsaicin cream on top of their skin. So that study, funded by the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, actually is one of the first modern studies to be done that showed in a randomized placebo-controlled fashion that cannabis does have a medicinal use, and that is for treatment of HIV-related peripheral neuropathy. And when we looked at our results, the effectiveness of cannabis in that situation is comparable to the effectiveness of the drug that's most commonly used, the anti-seizure medication. Now, do I think that the government will change cannabis's Schedule 1 classification, which means it has no accepted medical use, on the basis of a study of 25 patients smoking cannabis and 25 smoking placebo? No, I think I've been around long enough to know that that's not going to do it. After we demonstrated that cannabis had a medicinal use, we knew that people were still sort of against smoking a medicine. My colleagues say, gee, Donald, nobody smokes foxglove, we have digitalis. Using a whole plant as medicine is sort of archaic. Well, actually, it's my interest in cannabis that also got me interested in integrative medicine, and particularly in traditional Chinese medicine, where many of the treatments that are used are herbal concoctions or decoctions where the whole plant is used. And in Chinese medicine, extracting the active component and using that as a drug would be sort of unheard of, because it removes it from the yin and the yang, the balance provided by nature when the medicine has been given as a plant. So we knew that we could demonstrate that smoking cannabis was effective until we were blue in the face, and nobody was going to say that it should be approved because of the delivery system. So the Institute of Medicine report in 1999 suggested that people seek other rapid onset delivery systems for delivering cannabis as a medicine. So we did a clinical trial looking at a vaporizer and comparing the levels of cannabinoids that developed in the bloodstream after smoking a cannabis cigarette versus vaporizing the same cigarette. We did this in healthy marijuana smoking volunteers aged 25 to 40. It was the fastest clinical trial I've ever done because we had people lined up. It was very easy to enroll, and what we proved was that the levels of the cannabinoids in the bloodstream were equivalent whether it was smoked or vaporized, that there was much less exposure to noxious gases when it was vaporized as measured by expired carbon monoxide, that the high was graded as equal, and that patients actually had a preference for vaporization. So the next research that we did was to answer what I think is probably one of the more interesting questions, and that is there an interaction between cannabinoids and opioids in pain relief? So we took a group of patients who were taking a stable dose of either long-acting oxycodone or long-acting morphine, and we measured the level of the 12-hour release drug in their bloodstream before and then after 5 days of vaporizing cannabis 3 times a day. And what we found there was, interestingly, that the plasma levels of the opioids, either oxycodone or morphine, were actually decreased in the patients after exposure to the cannabis, but their pain relief was increased. So that's somewhat paradoxical, but my colleague, who's a pharmacologist, says that what we're seeing then is a so-called pharmacodynamic effect as opposed to a pharmacokinetic effect. If the cannabis had boosted the plasma levels of the opioids and led to decrease in pain, that would have been a pharmacokinetic effect. But instead, by some other mechanism, the cannabinoids allowed for more pain relief at lower plasma levels. So what does this mean? I mean, it means that for people who have pain, who are on opioids, they may be able to take lower dosages or the same dose for a longer period of time, and they may have actually decreased side effects because, as you know, opioid side effects include nausea, which cannabis can help, constipation. Many people think cannabis also helps constipation. For me, I think one of the tricky parts about this is that I'm aware that in some of the government hospitals, the VA hospitals, for example, or other military facilities, patients who are on chronic opioids have to have a negative urine cannabis test before they can get their drugs, and that seems a little short-sighted because people may actually be boosting the effect of their pain medicine by using cannabinoids in conjunction. And not a day goes by that I don't have to talk to a patient about medicine to increase their appetite, decrease their nausea, decrease their pain, help their sleep, and decrease their depression. Now, instead of writing prescriptions for 5 different medicines that all have potential side effects, I can tell a patient, you can take one medicine, and in fact, you can grow it yourself.